Welcome everyone to Adapting to COVID-19 Lessons for Leadership. My name is Abigail and I'm from Great Place to Work UK, and I'll be starting us off this morning as we look to explore what our COVID care survey is telling us about employees' feelings and priorities at work during the recent pandemic. Sharing today on this webinar, we have our guest speaker, Kerry Byrne, who is the Group People and Learning Director at the Sovini Group, and she'll be sharing with us their experiences and practices. We also have from Great Place to Work our Principal Consultants, Dr. Patrina Kamodi and Sarah Savonin, our Wellbeing Specialist and Consultant, who will also be speaking with us today. So today we'll be covering who we are, so some introductions into Great Place to Work UK as well as the Sovini Group. We'll go through our COVID-19 care survey findings, some implications for leaders, as well as how we can help. And at the end, we'll have a time for question and answer. So we are really happy to have you on the call today. So please do join in. We'd love to hear from you. If you have any questions as we go along, there's a Q&A function at the bottom. It should be on your screen. And so please do type your questions in. And also if you have any issues, technical issues, please do type them in and we'll have a look but we'll be taking the question and answers at the end of the webinar. So a bit about Great Place to Work UK. So we are the global authority with over 30 years experience when it comes to understanding workplace culture, employee experience and leadership behaviour. We offer insights through our survey and research, action to help organisations through consultancy, and recognition through our Best Workplaces programme with a range of lists, including UK's Best Workplaces lists and Best Workplaces for Women. And every year we publish our lists sharing organisational best practices, key insights and metrics, which we share in The Guardian and the Sunday Telegraph. We've worked with a range of organisations from different sizes, including Cisco, Indeed, Britvic and Workday. So now I'll hand over to Kerry Byrne, who will give us an introduction into the Sovini Group.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Kerry Byrne. I'm the Group People and Learning Director at the Sovini Group. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the group, we are primarily based in the Northwest. We are a property management and development company, and we have over 850 employees. We operate a unique business model, so it's made up of two key elements: our commercial companies and our not-for-profit companies, which is our Sovini Cooperative, and they are mainly housing associations, and they're all supported by the central services team who I work for. So our commercial companies provide services to our housing associations, but also trade externally. And this has enabled them to maximise on profits, which are then fed back into our housing associations, which has allowed us to build more properties and also provide better housing for our customers and our tenants. We also have our Sovini Charities, which was created to support our housing associations to make a real difference within the community. And in 2020, we came first in the UK Best Workplaces large category, which is something that we are really, really proud of. The next slide, please, Abby. Thanks. So although we're a unique group of different companies, we're all brought together by one common purpose: to create opportunities and change people's lives. As a group, we truly believe that our greatest asset is our people. And in order to meet our goal of being a world-class property management and development company, we believe that investing in our people is crucial. So you'll be hearing a little bit more from me about the Sovini Group later on in the webinar, but for now I'll pass back to Abby.
Thank you very much. So moving on to our COVID care survey. So the survey was put together to understand the impact of COVID-19 on employees and organisations. So the survey included a mixture of tick box and open-ended questions, and we had about 14,283 respondents from 65 companies. And the survey was ran earlier this year between April and June, And we had a variety of industries included in the survey, 12 to be specific, including education and training, not-for-profit organisations, and healthcare sector. So let's start by looking at what's on people's mind. So as part of one of our open-ended questions, we asked, what is your biggest work-related concern at this time? So the first most prominent concern we found in our sample was this idea around finances and job security. Secondly, we found that getting the COVID-19 virus, so the transmission, was a concern. And lastly, was around return to work and what it looks like in the future. And so just to share some of the comments that we've seen. So the first one is concerns around the discussions management are having around redundancies. And the second comment, as you can see, is concerns around returning to work and the risk of getting infection. So those were some of the things that we found in our comments. So in our COVID care survey, we found 4 key patterns. So the first one, which is good to share, was that overall organisations that chose to take part actually received favourable feedback on the employee experience. So generally views were positive. When we look at workload and seniority, we can see that people felt that workload was pretty much the same, but when we break it down and look at employee level, management seemed to have reported that they had greater workload. So there may have been some challenges there, which we'll explore as we go through the webinar. When it comes to gender and caring, results were similar amongst gender, so male and females, but more women did report to have more responsibilities for caring for older, ill or disabled people. But in terms of childcare responsibilities, there was no difference between male and females and what they had. But we did find some other differences amongst gender when it came to other elements of caring, which we'll also explore later down the line. The last key pattern was by sector, and we did find some differences as well. For example, we found that IT companies, so information technology companies, did score more favourably. We'll explore some of the other things that we found under sector as well. So here are the overall results for the COVID care survey, ranked from highest to lowest out of 100%, with the higher scores indicating more favourable average responses to the questions. And just to give you an idea of the standard that we have here, if you look at all the results together, the average score is about 85%. So as a whole, as I mentioned earlier, views are more positive, especially around, as you can see, with the top statements, feeling trusted. So that trust, people do feel like they're trusted to do their job. Downwards communication, so management are keeping people informed about the impact of COVID-19 on the organisation, and also perceived fairness. So should I need to take time off, I feel my organisation would treat me fairly. When we look at the other end of the spectrum, so the bottom statements, you can see some concerns there around having the equipment and the resources they need to do their job effectively. And again, this theme of effectiveness runs through in terms of whether people feel that they can work as effectively working remotely than they usually do. And so we'll be looking at some of these statements and patterns in more detail, and this is what Sarah's going to go through as she takes us through a deep dive.
Thank you, Abby, and morning, everyone. So let's look a bit more closely at workload to start with. So the single biggest group of respondents, 35%, said they have about the same workload as usual. But overall, 42% of people said they either have a bit more work or much more work than usual, which is a lot more than the people who said they have a bit less or much less work than usual. So overall, we can say that people either have about the same workload or it's increased a little bit during COVID-19. But ultimately, individual experiences do vary between this whole spectrum, between a lot more work and a lot less work. And that really comes out in the comments, the sort of qualitative side of the data that we see. So you can see some comments here. The bottom one, someone feeling extremely kind of overwhelmed with work demands and sensing some unfairness from management about having to cope with these, in addition with all the anxieties of the situation as it is. And then another person at the other end of the spectrum feeling quite guilty for actually being paid full time because they simply don't have enough workload at the moment, even though they might as well be very productive and willing to do work at home, but there's just not enough to do at the moment. But the pattern becomes quite a bit clearer if we break the data up by managerial level, as you can see here. So if you go up in seniority, essentially, so from employees to frontline managers to mid-level managers and to senior managers, you can see that the proportion of people who are saying they have a bit more work than usual is going up, and especially the proportion of people saying they have much more work than usual is going up by an even greater margin. And simultaneously, people who say they have around the same workload or a bit less work than usual, that's going down. So it's really an issue of management, of mid-managers and senior managers specifically who are dealing with this challenge of increased workload, which is probably quite understandable considering during COVID-19, a lot of the day-to-day work for mid and senior management has ensured or ensuring the survival of the business in the short term and in the long term, as well as all the challenges of managing a remote workforce. So Carrie, it'll be interesting to hear a little bit from you at this point, whether this is something the Sovini Group has noticed as well, whereby the sort of mid and senior managers have really struggled with increased workload and by extension, maybe stress levels during this time.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree. There are certain teams within the group that have seen an increase in workload, and specifically our managers. I think kind of in the early stages, we had to adapt to different ways of working. There were a number of changes and updates from the government in terms of the guidelines. We had to, to respond to these. And then more recently, we're looking at these changes as an opportunity to change the way that we work in the future. So I would definitely say for our managers and senior managers, there has been an increase in workload. For us, I think it's all about kind of, talking to each other and communication. So looking out for each other, making sure that everybody's okay, and making sure that people take time out. So if you realise or you notice that somebody's struggling, have those conversations regardless of how senior they are, and make sure that they're given the time off as well to make sure they can continue to be an effective leader. But yeah, I would agree that for us, we have seen an increase.
Thank you, Carrie. Okay, if we go on to the next slide. So another interesting demographic pattern that we looked at was gender as well as care status. So overall, we found that men and women actually responded very similarly to the survey. So there were no real or significant gender differences overall. But when we specifically look at the group of people who care for 2 or more individuals, so this could be children, older people, ill or disabled individuals, then we found some gender differences. So we found, first of all, that women were about 9 percentage points more favorable in saying that their organization's flexibility is helping them meet their needs as a working carer or parent. Then we found that men were 7 percentage points more favorable in saying that it's easy for them to be as effective when working from home as they would be in their usual workplace. So maybe this suggests that the actual pursuit of this work-life balance or trying to juggle these 2 responsibilities, that's completely independent of how productive or effective you can actually be when you do find those slots to work. And we have this nice comment here that gives us a real glimpse into the everyday reality of trying to really struggle or juggle these 2 different lives. And interestingly, this person, one of our respondents, suspected that this is an issue that falls disproportionately to women. Interestingly, in our data, we didn't actually find any real difference in the number of men and women who have 2 or more caring responsibilities, nor in the numbers of men and women who care for children, so who are parents. If we go to the next slide. So another sort of interesting thing that we found was, even though there's been this real focus on supporting working carers, for very good reason, of course, we found that we can't disadvantage those people who don't have caring responsibilities, who may of course be facing a whole array of their own personal challenges during this time, whether they speak up about them or not. So we may simply be unaware. And that sort of perceived unfairness is illustrated quite nicely in these quotes here. So on the left-hand side, we have a carer's perspective, essentially arguing that performance management has to take into account that these people have this whole spectrum of additional challenges now on the home front. They cannot be as productive, or they cannot work to the same level of output or performance as they normally could. And then we have a non-carer's perspective here on the right-hand side, essentially saying that they not only need to maybe compensate for the lack of output on the care side, but it's kind of unfair for them because they might also need a break. They might also need the same kind of empathy that seems to be extended much more openly to the carers as opposed to the non-carers. So I think the real takeaway here is that this sense of compassion and flexibility and this sort of empathy, it really does need to be extended to all employees, whether they're carers or not. And that's something that's really going to come down to individual people managers. Next slide, please, Evan. So as we've kind of alluded to, another thing we looked at was sector and how the different sectors sort of vary in their scores. Now, this is not an exhaustive list of the different sectors that we had in our sample, but these were some of the biggest ones in terms of sample size and robustness. So on the left here, looking at the all statement average, we find the kind of typical pattern as we often do in our data, where IT scores very, very high, pharma relatively high, and then non-for-profit education and healthcare somewhat lower. So this was quite a typical pattern, which was also the case in the care survey. On the right-hand side, so we're looking at whether employees feel like they're actually meeting customer expectations at this time. A slightly different pattern where healthcare kind of jumps up, which again is probably quite intuitive given the very unique role that healthcare has in our society right now for humanity overall. And we can see that education and training is really hard hit by this at the moment. I'm looking at a few more statements on the next slide. So we looked at workload being higher than usual. And if you look at the numbers here, it does seem like workload on average is higher than usual across all of these sectors, especially in IT, biotechnology and pharma, as well as healthcare. And then a really interesting statement was whether it's easy for people to work as effectively remotely compared to when they're working in their usual place. And it seems to be a challenge pretty much across all sectors. It's only really IT who seem to more or less be working effectively or as effectively as usual when at home. And again, it's education and training that seems to be the sort of most impacted by this. And this is intuitive given the amount of face-to-face contact that typically does need to exist between educators and their customers, who are students in this case. And that comes across in this quote quite nicely. So this is from a higher education institute that took part in our survey. All right, if we move on. So we've mentioned the first open-ended question we asked, which was, what's your biggest work-related concern right now? The other question we asked was, what could your organization do to support you better at this time? And to our initial surprise, the most common response to this question was nothing. There is nothing. The organization can't do any more to support me right now. And that could be either because the organization has already exhausted all the different ways it can support its workforce, which could be practical, financial, emotional, mental health, all these sorts of different ways they can help. Or individuals do need support or do need help or have certain needs, but it's simply outside the scope of what the organization or the employer could feasibly offer them. And this also says something about the caliber of organizations that we work with who have responded really, really well to this crisis. But the second and third most common theme, tools and resources and communication, are really quite interesting. We're going to delve a little bit deeper into these because these can contain some really actionable takeaways for organizations given what employees are saying they would really like right now. So if we go to the next slide, we can look a little bit deeper into what people are saying about tools and resources, which was ultimately the second most common response to this question. So as you can see from these examples, it kind of covers the whole working from home setup, ergonomics, just equipment, desks, monitors, chairs, the things that you have to work with from home, and then also kind of systems, online work processes that might be causing frustrations because they just don't work as smoothly in the home environment as they would in the usual environment. And even though these are kind of boring, not very exciting, they tell us that we really can't underestimate getting these basics right in order for people to work productively from home and hopefully also be able to thrive doing so. And then the third most commonly cited theme was communication. And you might recall when we talked through the statements in our care survey, top-down communication was actually one of the three most highest scoring in the kind of quantitative side of the data. So it might seem strange that communication came up as a sort of weakness or a priority area in the qualitative data. But I think the answer to that might lie in the nuances of these comments. So it's not necessarily is management keeping us informed or updated, but it's how are they doing so? What's the method? What's the timing of these communications? So for example, the bottom comment talks about being kind of overwhelmed with too much information. There's no time to process it. And then the one on the left-hand side talks a little bit about top leadership being personable and visible in their communications, which obviously has a big impact on culture and morale. And then we had quite a lot of comments about more the sort of transparency side of decision-making processes, people wanting to know what's going on behind the scenes, but then also really be involved in these decisions, have a dialogue about it, because there are obviously very high stakes for individuals involved. So Carrie, it would be really interesting again to hear a little bit about whether the Sovini Group has had any major challenges with communication during this time, and what are the ways that you've kind of overcome those challenges?
Yeah, so I mean, the last 6 months have been very challenging. Our culture is very much kind of centered around a busy kind of welcoming head office. So on numerous occasions, we've had visitors comment on how they could almost feel the culture of the organisation when they came into our reception. So that was kind of the heart of our culture. So moving to a remote workforce, it has been a challenge. Half of our workforce work remotely, so they work within our communities. So it's always been something that's been a priority for us to make sure that we communicate and engage with all of our staff. As a group of companies as well, it's important that we all link together. You know, we don't work in silos. The decisions that we make will affect different parts of the business. So definitely making sure that we maintain that contact between the different companies, between the different employees, has been important and has been challenging working in this way. Prior to COVID, we hadn't installed Teams on everybody's devices, and not all employees had laptops. So that was kind of an immediate practical challenge that we had to overcome. And we also had employees with poor networks, so people at home that didn't necessarily have a good internet provider. So again, we've had to work with those employees to ensure that they can work effectively from home. And at the beginning of the kind of the lockdown, the updates were quite rapid. There were quite a lot of changes, you know, that they become sort of thick and fast. So we worked closely with our comms team to make sure that the messages were out on time, that they were clear, and that we used the most appropriate way of getting those messages out to staff, which I'll talk about shortly. And as we moved into kind of the later stages of lockdown, we realised that the kind of importance of engaging with employees informally. So where you might just have a general chat with somebody in the corridor, those sorts of interactions were missing. You were generally calling people because you needed to talk to them about work, but missing those interactions and those social interactions between staff. And we recognised the importance of this, so that was something that we've hugely kind of looked into and prioritised for us. So if you could just go to the next slide. So how we've addressed it. During the initial stages, we recognised straight away that engagement was going to be key to any success. So very early on, we set up daily meetings with our executive management team to ensure that all of the businesses were working together. We set up a specific coronavirus comms channel, which was through our emails and also through our employee app. So it was very visible to staff when there was an update regarding COVID. We supplemented these with regular updates, video updates from our CEO, which were really well received. So initially, he was doing some updates within the office in the sort of very, very early stages. And then it moved on to from home. So again, we got to see our CEO in his surroundings at home. We made our employees aware of all the support they could access via our e-learning system. So there are a number of courses that we sent out, things around reducing the spread of infection, things around 5 ways to wellbeing. And we continue to hold managers forums and staff briefings. So we held them virtually. But we did find them really successful. We had really high attendance and we had really high engagement levels, lots of questions from staff, lots of interaction. So that was a real positive for us. And over the last 6 months, we've had our employee app for a couple of years now. but we've definitely seen that that's been a key method of communication with our employees. We've seen usage increase by over 25%, and we've also seen an increase in employees populating content themselves. We've also had employees leading on activities and taking the lead on that, which again, I'll show you a little bit more about later on in the webinar. So I'll pass on to back to yourself, Trina, and I'll come back and explain a bit more about how we maintained our culture during this time.
Thank you so much, Kerry, for that really valuable insight into what you've been doing at Sovini Group. And we wanted just to pause at this moment and just have a think about some of what Kerry's shared and also what we've shared from our care survey in terms of what might this mean, what struck us as the notions and concepts that were important across organisations. So we've heard, of course, that there are some key differences by sectors, some of which we might expect, that naturally we know that each organisation and culture is unique. Nevertheless, stepping back, there seem to be some shared challenges. So managers working more, people working in different places to those in which they typically work, different communication approaches, challenges and solutions, challenges around tools, and perhaps as well individual challenges around perhaps care and responsibilities or not. So some of the things that struck us, some of them are consistently important, but we would argue take on a greater resonance or importance now. We would advocate putting people first, and I think that was something that Kerry very much portrayed as well, and thinking about the informal interactions to help really understand where people are at. So the first thing that really struck us in terms of success being important, the role of leaders and managers at the moment, is encouraging organisations to really listen with care to each individual, to understand and to focus on each person's well-being. And I think Sarah drew us to the notion of, yes, we need to be flexible and understand the needs of carers, but also focus on people who aren't caring, so that understand each individual's perspective and be flexible, but also seek to be fair and consistent. Not only are managers working more hours, but they're dealing with different challenges. So we're reminded of the importance to support them, to support their team members. In terms of the bigger picture, as ever, it's critical to provide clear direction and set clear expectations, as well as to get those nice underpinning processes right. Kerry mentioned the practical details around laptops and getting people onto Teams, for example. But some senior leadership aspects which strike us as particularly important at this time are in terms of visibility at a time when we're communicating through different channels, and also, as Kerry also referenced, clear, succinct, timely communication, as well as adaptation of the plan to ensure continued organisational success. And certainly from the literature as well as personal experience, it's really critical at times like this to admit to uncertainty and the newness of the situation, and indeed even vulnerabilities, in order to provide a realistic picture for people, but also to enhance their trust and credibility of your message. Thank you. May we have the next slide, please? So I've mentioned a couple of times on the last slide at the bottom and on this slide again, trust is key. To us as an organisation, we always have been about individuals in work and how they work together and fostering high trust, high engagement cultures, because that's the right thing to do for us as humans, but also because it drives productivity and profitability. We think now more than ever, the trust that we place in each other to help the organisation be a success is key. But the obvious question that lots of us are asking was, what does the future really look like? Will the new normal be truly different, or will we just slowly lapse back into the old ways? For some organisations who hadn't in large part worked remotely, they found that it actually has worked. Will they now embrace it, and will the future be more agile, and will there be more opportunities to grow talent and have a richer organisations through to a more diverse talent pool? So these are some of the questions that we've been mulling over and would have views on, and we may choose to come to in the Q&A. But I'd like now to hand back to Kerry to respond in terms of the Sovini Group in the future. Thank you, Kerry.
Thank you. So yeah, I would agree that as a group, we have decided that we won't go back to the way that we were working before, that there are lots of opportunities with the way that we work at the moment, you know, a more agile approach. So we've carried out a strategic review against the Great Place to Work culture audit framework, to make sure that all of our practices are fit for purpose and they do allow us to continue to develop and shape our culture and maintain the culture that we've already got. So we did this against the framework, but we also did it against our own people strategy. So it gave us a bit more information, and you can see down the side of where we needed to kind of focus our attention in the immediate, you know, immediately. So as you can see from that, an area, an example to us is around celebrating. As a company, we love to socialise, we love to have fun, and under the current guidelines, it definitely is more difficult and more challenging, as I'm sure you'll all agree. So we've used the virtual platform to bring our employees together, which I will show you a little bit about what we've done shortly. Another area for us was recruitment and onboarding. So to ensure that candidates still had the same experience and to ensure that we were still getting the right employees for the right job, it was really important that we looked at that process and made sure that still worked for us. We also wanted to make sure that employees got all the right information in the right few weeks so that they were given the right support, especially during those kind of early months. Initially, we did see a drop in recruitment levels, but over the last couple of months, that started to take off again, and we are recruiting to a number of roles. So this is something that we're continuing to develop at the moment, and getting feedback from our new starters. Sitting alongside the strategic review, we sent out a survey to all staff, asking them for feedback on the new working practices, what they found challenging, and what they enjoyed. And then all of our directors met with their teams at informal coffee mornings to talk to them more about how they were feeling and how they could support them more. And this was also really important in determining, you know, where we should focus our initial attention. Our CEO then followed that up with online virtual discussions with staff, highlighting some of the comments that were sent back and taking any questions. So as part of that review, it's been really, really useful for us. So just in terms of the next slide, so as I've mentioned previously, we did realise that kind of that social interaction with our staff was really, really important. So I've just put together a few slides about the types of things that we've been doing over the last 6 months of how we've engaged with our staff. So we've launched a number of different competitions. As you can see from this, we did Sovini and Bloom, which was getting staff to engage in growing their own. During sort of the initial stages of lockdown of COVID, we launched an initiative about back to school, which was to encourage staff to share ideas about homeschooling and any resources that they had tapped into. We also did Lunch and Learn, which is a programme that we've been running for quite a few years, but we've adapted that and we've done that virtually now. So again, it's been quite nice to see people within their own homes. You know, we've been involved in live baking classes, and we're about to do a DIY kind of around the home. So sort of hints and tips. And then lastly on this slide was build a Sovini van. So this was a way of getting our kind of extended Sovini family involved, so our Sovini juniors, the children of our staff. So we sent out templates for all of our staff's children, and asked them to design their own Sovini van. We had some really creative entries, and our winner actually designed a unicorn van. So they had a tail and a horn, and their little girl explained that the van could get to our tenants more quickly, which we thought was fantastic. So she was our winner for that competition. Just to the next slide. So this slide's more about how our employees have got involved and how we've got to know each other a bit more, our employees basically. Our director, Dave Brown, he's put together a playlist based on requests from staff, for us all to enjoy. We've got Kate from our finance team who leads on our Fitness Fridays, so she does Zumba, she does yoga classes, and we've also held our Bring Your Dog to Zoom day. So again, that was a way of us getting to know our employees and their families, their extended families, and get to know one another. And then finally on this slide was our Sovini Spotlight. So that's been an opportunity to meet our new starters, get to know a bit more about them, ask them some questions and for them to share some information with us. And then just on the next slide, last one from me, but definitely not the least, we hosted our own bingo. So this was in celebration of us coming first for UK Best Workplaces. So we held a Sovini bingo, which was, our host was Steve Scott in our People and Learning team. So again, our staff have been involved in getting these activities and initiatives. It was great fun. We had dance-offs, we had special guests, including our CEO. So we were able to mix some of our comms and engagement on a more informal level. So we've just got a short video to show you now.
The Sovini Group! Our very own Anne Struggle.
So I hope that gives you a bit of a flavour about what we've been up to, and I'll pass back to Patrina.
Thank you so much, Kerry. That was fantastic. Thank you. So stepping back from all that rich information, I suppose really just to underline our key message that we firmly believe that trust in each other and within an organisation is key. We naturally focus on helping organisations to drive and grow trust. For us, particular focus areas are around credibility of senior leadership, decency, respect and fairness within organisations, camaraderie, so how people work together, and the sense of pride that derives from strong performance in those above 4 areas. There are probably an awful lot of focus areas, and I hope we might get in the discussion some other people's views, but from our perspective, this now is an opportunity for us in the workplace to focus more than ever on outcomes. So what are the results of people's efforts and outcomes, and place less emphasis on when and how long, but more on the outcomes and productivity. It struck us as key, naturally, to support managers with their greater, and you might argue more challenging workload, to support their people and encourage a truly listening culture. And I think we mentioned a few times through the importance of empathy and understanding individuals and driving that challenging notion of balancing flexibility and fairness. And certainly we would advocate recognising the whole person at work. What do they bring at work? And if we recognise and value individuals as whole people, and they're more likely to reciprocate that and help drive our organisations forward, as well as it being the right thing to do at a human level. Thank you. May we move on to our next slide, please? And then just finally, before we've got a nice amount of time to chat and have Q&A if we'd like to, but finally, before we do, just to say, as Abby mentioned at the beginning, a great place to work. We're here to support where we can, and really there are 3 strands around that at this challenging time, helping clients understand what really are the heart of employee concerns and challenges and opportunities at this time through insight, surveys, focus groups and so on. to action, supporting organisations to thrive and improve, whether it's through advice or training or coaching, for example, and then the celebration piece. So recognising, particularly important at this tough time, I think, efforts of organisation and the achievement of best workplaces through our certification and awards. So if we can help, we'd obviously love to, and please do feel free to reach out to us. But without further ado, I shall hand back to Abby. Thank you, Abby.
Thank you very much, Katrina. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We have a few questions and it's time for our Q&A section. And so the first question we have from JT, who has said, yeah, thank you everyone for the great insights, but they're interested to know more about how we can ensure flexibility and fairness, particularly as it seems treatment towards carers or non-carers may be unconscious. Yeah, so I'd like to, maybe Sarah, would you like to start us off with an answer?
Sure. Yes, I agree absolutely. The treatment and the sort of ways we think about carers and non-carers may be unconscious, and it's completely natural as well to maybe have this kind of, not preferential treatment, but maybe an increased level of flexibility or sort of compassion towards carers. But you do have to keep in mind that as we kind of alluded to, you'll never, or you might never really know an individual's real circumstances at home, or the challenges that they're dealing with, or the problems that they have, including carers. There is research out there by Carers UK and Employers for Carers that because of the stigma involved, even carers might not speak up about their true responsibilities or everything that they have going on the home front. So ultimately, the only way to really know is to ask directly and have an open conversation about these things. This is with carers and non-carers, of course. So it really does come down to having close and trusting relationships between people managers and their direct reports. And it does come down to how supportive and empathetic these individuals can be. And as we've alluded to, as Katrina said on the previous slide, this is enabled by a kind of wider culture of well-being and of putting people first. And of course, it might be a sort of slow process of cultural change, of moving towards this kind of level of flexibility and fairness that's extended to everybody. But it might involve some sort of upskilling maybe for people managers specifically, maybe some sort of unconscious bias training, but also really empowering everybody to speak up, because it's obviously not just the people manager's responsibility. It is also everybody's responsibility to sort of speak up and make their needs and working preferences heard. I don't know if Katrina or Carrie or Abby have anything to add to that.
Oh, thank you so much, Sarah. That my feeling very much echo those. I think the central point that you've actually raised is around listening and empathy, and for managers to drive cultures that are listening cultures and to be supported in doing so, that people can raise concerns and have open dialogue and feel able to raise their needs. In terms of, and it's undoubtedly a real challenge to balance flexibility and fairness. And as well as that decency and positive, strong, trusting human relationship piece, we would obviously say that it's important to have clear and fair and shared policies so that people know what the ground rules are, what the flexibility is, and what autonomy they have as individuals to flex around that. So it's transparency, as well as having a positive interaction style and trust.
Thank you very much, Katrina. So I hope that's answered that question. So moving on to the next question that we have. So it's how can you improve communication and making sure these are read? Sometimes it can be too much communication, which people seem to ignore.
Yeah, so if I just jump in there, first of all, this is a kind of like that comment we had about people feeling kind of overwhelmed with too many communications or feeling a bit bombarded, no time to process what's happening to us. So I would absolutely say this is an issue in several organizations at the moment, or definitely has been this past spring. And it probably does come down to streamlining the different communication channels in place. So there might be a lot of different ways that leadership send communications or top-down communications occur. And it will be completely dictated by organizational structure as well as people's preferences. But ultimately it does come down to seeing what works, what do people actually want, and if you don't know, that it's worth maybe asking people in some sort of pulse survey or focus groups or that kind of thing. What are the best ways to get these communications down to people? What kind of methods do they want to see? What will they engage with, essentially? And then trying to keep those key messages in a consistent place, whether it's maybe a weekly bulletin that's written or an all hands call, but just making sure it's not all over the place. Though of course trying to reach all sort of different groups of employees. So if some are a bit more remote or have different sort of circumstances, maybe no access to a regular sort of email or laptop, maybe during phone communications as well. So making sure they reach everybody, but they're not too all over the place. Again, if someone has anything to add.
I mean, I'd agree with you, Sarah. Initially, there was lots and lots of information going out. So on one sort of communication, we had almost 4 items. So it was about making sure that we planned ahead and we knew what we were going to send out. We'd also have regular meetings with our communications team and make sure we prioritised what was important that day, maybe put something that wasn't quite as important back to the following day, and made sure that it you know, there wasn't too much information going out for staff, and to make sure nothing was missed, really. But yeah, using different types of communication was really important as well.
Thank you very much. I believe somebody raised a hand, and it may be to do with the question that was asked. So I think it's Karaman Anur. I've just unmuted you. Would you like to share your question?
So, hi, that's a wrong click. Sorry about it.
Okay, thank you.
I am listening.
Okay, thank you. So the next question that we have here is, so with online activities, how do you ensure that less outgoing people are supported?
And if I may just dive in very quickly, this is, a really, I think, important question to make sure that the diversity and richness of everybody's views and opinions is taken on board. And I think part of the answer is falling back again on decent, strong and trusting relationships so that people are more likely to feel comfortable. But undoubtedly, it's also about the approaches that you take to sharing, discussion and gathering information. So I would say absolutely, again, and this is probably slightly the flip side of Sarah's response, but use a variety of different approaches and see what works for you, but also recognise that one size doesn't fit all. Think about, particularly if you're looking to seek input and decision making and you have a relatively large group, could you break it down into small groups? Could you gather information in advance so that people who perhaps prefer to reflect more have the opportunity to reflect and share information in advance? And just, I suppose, in summary, one size doesn't fit all. Think about different ways of doing things, smaller groups, one-to-one. Think about occasionally using perhaps the telephone rather than always an online meeting. I know, controversial to say don't have a video call at the moment, but also think about methods such as gathering views up front, but absolutely sensitivity to the needs of different people to make sure we get the richness of people's views is critical.
I'd just probably add to that. We've had sort of discussions with our management team and managers forum about engagement and their role. And some of the examples that I shared with you were kind of company-wide initiatives. But the feedback that we were getting from managers was we're doing things as teams. So we're engaging as teams, so a lot smaller, engaging on a one-to-one level. And it's about kind of knowing and giving people the opportunity. So with things like, you know, our Fitness Fridays, explaining that people don't have to have their video on, you know, they can take part without a video, you know, making sure that all those things are communicated to the staff, and also asking them for feedback about what they would like to see. So if it's something that they're not comfortable with, you know, what would you like us to do in future, either as a business or as a team? And gathering that feedback. But yeah, it is important to make sure that you cater for all employees.
Thank you very much, Kerry. And just to finally add as well, I think, yeah, just providing the opportunities both open and not open. So if there are certain things that you can put into place where people can share their views anonymously, that's always important. So I know from my experience, when we have our team meetings and so on, we always use this program called Mentimeter, where people can share their views, how they're feeling. And we have a question. It's not just, oh, do you have any questions? It's also, how are you feeling? So people can even share how they're feeling. So the people who are not as outgoing can share anonymously if they don't feel like they can openly. Thank you. And so the last question, actually, Kerry, this is directed to you. It's, have you experienced any resistance from groups or colleagues who are unable to perform their role from home? And if so, how have you overcome the challenge of them, of a them and us culture?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say it was resistance. We've had employees feeding back that maybe, you know, they needed more support with their workstations. So we've worked with them individually. You know, we've allowed them to take their chairs home and made sure that they were comfortable. It's not necessarily that they haven't been able to perform their role. In the early stages, we had our customer service team didn't have the facilities to work from home. But our IT team worked really quickly to make sure that they could. So within sort of about three or 4 days, they had all the equipment set up to enable them to work from home. So there were probably some challenges at the very beginning with regards to being able to perform their role. But in terms of like moving forward, it was more around just sort of tweaking maybe their workstations and making them more comfortable. In terms of, yeah, we have people that work in the office and we have people that work out within our communities, and we've always had that. So, you know, we try to explain to our staff, you know, why we have to work in certain ways and just be fully open and you know, communicate with them about why we do certain things, and why it's important for people in certain roles to work the way they do. So I think it's just more about communicating with everybody and being really open to avoid that kind of them and us type of culture.
Thank you very much, Kerry. Is there anyone, Sarah or Katrina, more generally, maybe exploring the them and us culture that you've had experience and anything you could share?
I think for me, it would be just a very general point in terms of communication and ensuring as much clarity and transparency and effective communication, and reducing chances for them and us culture to emerge, as well as focusing on communicating around the work to be done, also communicating as humans so that we maintain our bonds, because I think that's one of the things that having a less strong bond between us can encourage a them and us culture far more strongly than if we have stronger bonds and know and have greater empathy with each other. So a general point.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think that's all the questions we have for today. I'd like to thank everyone for attending and joining in with your questions. We'll be sending up a follow-up email with the recording and feedback, because we'd love to hear how you found the webinar. So please do take a few minutes to complete the feedback. And if you have any other questions, or if more generally you would love to get in touch, you can email us at uk_info@greatplacetowork.com, as well as our websites, LinkedIn and Twitter. Thank you so much for today, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.